A troubled woman attempts to reunite her divorced parents by using her hemorrhoids to engineer a chance encounter. Helen Memel is skateboarding when her hemorrhoids start bothering her. Inside, she reminisces about her childhood, particularly how her mother was very particular about hygiene. Helen once cleaned the bathroom, and when she went outside, Mrs. Memel urged her to jump into her arms. However, her mother let her fall to the ground, warning her never to trust anyone. This confusing childhood led Helen to reject many of her mother's teachings, including hygiene, and now she takes pleasure in exposing herself to filthy situations. She gets some food and meets a random person, then offers him a different type of meal, which they share together. Helen takes a commemorative photo and heads home, careful to preserve a parting gift she received. Still hungry, she satisfies herself with some vegetables, then takes a bath and teases her younger brother, Tony. Helen then tends to her avocado seeds. In the living room, Mrs. Memel is unpacking her latest religious items with her new husband. Her mother has had many religious obsessions in the past, and her latest after the divorce is Catholicism. Bell rings and their neighbor Karina welcomes them to the building. After a few crass remarks from Helen, Mrs. Memel closes the door, mortified by her daughter's behavior. Recalls Karina's previous ex, a heavy metal drummer with a particular fondness for his band. However, rumors about their unorthodox, intimate relationship spread, causing their schoolmates to mock Karina. Helen visits her wealthy father, Mr. Memel, and intrudes on his pleasurable time with his girlfriend, driven by her unconditional love for her parents. That night, she tells her father she will force him to reunite with her mother once he becomes infirm, but he just laughs at the idea. During one of Tony's religious plays, Helen shares the same plan with her mother, but Mrs. Memel expresses disgust at the thought of being with her ex-husband again. The next day, Helen has a shaving accident on her lower region and is excused from school to go to the hospital, where she is abruptly examined by Dr. Knotts. He informs her that she will need surgery. Helen expresses concern about the possibility of incontinence as a side effect, but the nurse assures her it's rare. Helen reflects on how her current situation resulted from shaving. She recalls that she wouldn't have started shaving if not for someone at work. Intrigued by her co-worker's invitation, she went to his dingy apartment and received an intimate shave. Later, after her recollection, Nurse Robin walks in and assists Helen in getting ready for her scheduled surgery. As he wheels her to the operating room, Helen considers which hobby she would sacrifice to ensure a surgery without side effects. Inside the elevator, Valerie, who is actually Robin's ex-girlfriend, overhears them discussing something crass. Before the surgery, Robin and Helen banter until she writes her parents' numbers on his arm, instructing him to call them and ensure they are united at her bedside. Under anesthesia, Helen recalls a memory from before Tony was born when her family was at the beach. Her father carelessly applied sunblock, resulting in a bad sunburn. That night, he gave her an avocado seed, sparking her passion for avocados. Later, her mother told her to sleep on her own mattress because the bed was too cramped. She also remembers her 7th birthday when she played mediator between her parents during an argument. After Tony's birth, her attempts to reconcile them no longer worked, and they eventually divorced. Helen recalls more recent events, like teaching Karina how to attract her crush, Michael. After Michael left, they annoyed Tony while taking a bath together. Helen confessed she underwent two-ball ligation and didn't tell her parents. Once Karina went home, Helen took care of her avocados while Tony tossed and turned in bed. After the medical procedure, Helen wakes up to Robin, informing her that the surgery was successful. However, he couldn't reach her parents, though he informed them about her condition. She requests to keep the part removed during surgery, not wanting it to end up in the trash. Robin promises to check if it's possible. He then wheels her back to her room, letting her listen to songs he made for Valerie. Helen imagines a scenario where her mother has a fatal accident, and her last thoughts are about whether her underwear is clean. Inspecting her own unclean clothes, Robin offers to have them washed, but she declines, saying they're good for at least another week. Later, Valerie brings food to Helen, advising her to eat to aid regular bowel movements and her recovery. The next morning, Helen wakes up to find she has soiled herself. She tries to clean up as best she can, and then calls for Robin's assistance. After helping her, she asks him to take a picture of her wounds. Robin reluctantly agrees, but just as he finishes, Dr. Knotts enters the room. The doctor asks if she's had a bowel movement yet, and Helen lies, saying no. The doctor sniffs around, skeptical, but Helen confidently denies it. She shows him a photo of her wound. Just then, Mrs. Memel enters the room. Dr. Knotts introduces himself and shares the good news of the successful operation, but Helen disagrees. Once the doctor leaves, Helen remarks that the staff will now hate her. She comments that her mother arrived too early and asks her to come back after work. Helen also requests that the crucifix in her room be taken down, but Mrs. Memel refuses. Helen then faints from severe pain, prompting her mother to remove the crucifix. Right after Mrs. Memel asks about her daughter's hemorrhoids, Helen responds that they're hereditary, and she's always had them. Her mother disagrees, stating Helen didn't have them when she was young. Before leaving, Mrs. Memel takes out some of Helen's avocado plants. The avocado seed triggers a memory of Helen's childhood love for soft textures and surfaces, and how she learned early on to only enjoy them in private. Later, Helen watches Robin play with the avocado seed and starts to imagine it as a part of him. Suddenly, she envisions an avocado plant growing out of her. Helen reveals that despite her desire to have a child, where her mother cried while preparing a large turkey for a dinner with friends. Her father's comment about carving the turkey reminded him of Helen's birth made the guests laugh, except for Mrs. Memel. As they ate, Mrs. Memel showed the guests where she was carved and threw wine at her husband before storming off, concluding Helen's recollection. The next day, Mr. Memel visits his daughter and brings a book about slugs, reminiscing about her curiosity about them. Helen tries to stall him by asking him to read the book, hoping her mother will arrive soon. However, Mr. Memel reads only a brief portion, promising to finish it upon her discharge. As he leaves, Mrs. Memel arrives, and they profess their love to each other and kiss. But this is only in Helen's imagination, and Mr. Memel leaves without much ado. Soon, Robin visits Helen, and they start talking about her exhibitionist tendencies. Robin playfully agrees, and Helen tells him the story of a brothel near her house. When she turned 18, she went there and shows him a woman with copper hair. As Helen narrates the story, she immerses him in the experience. Suddenly, Valerie enters the room, and Robin is visibly flustered, but he doesn't miss a beat. After Robin leaves, Valerie dismisses him. Valerie menacingly informs Helen that it would be best if she had a bowel movement soon, reminding her to dispose of her residue properly, as it's highly infectious, triggering a childhood memory. Helen recalls a time when she received compliments on her own long lashes, which visibly annoyed her mother. Later that night, she woke up to her mother cutting off her lashes, though she's unsure if it was a dream or reality due to the substances she's taken. One day, Michael mistakenly left a stash of illicit substances behind, so Karina and Helen embarked on a fun-fueled adventure. They journeyed from their house to the subway, a club, and eventually ended with them abandoning Michael, who got in trouble with his suppliers and didn't talk to his friends for a while. During their adventure, Helen adopted a rat as a pet, but her mother's cleanliness didn't allow it for long. In retaliation, Helen considered killing her mother's new husband. Later that night, since her father isn't around, Helen rudely tells her to come back tomorrow. Exasperated, Mrs. Memel hopes that Helen's daughter treats her similarly, Unaware that Helen can't have children, Helen explores the hospital and stumbles upon the nurses celebrating Valerie's birthday. Before the doors close, she witnesses Valerie kissing Robin. Afterwards, Helen orders pizza and beer, threatening violent acts if the pizza isn't fresh. While waiting, she takes a ride outside the hospital with her skateboard, leaving her post-op residue as an offering on one of the hospital's religious statues. As she does, Helen remarks on how close she and Karina are. She remembers a moment together when they both had their period simultaneously. Soon after her reminiscence, the pizza arrives. When Robin sees that Helen ordered it, he offers to sponsor her since she doesn't have any money. While they eat, Helen explains her harsh treatment of the delivery guy, telling a story about two girls who mistreated a pizza store when their order was late. When it finally arrived, it tasted strange, so they had it analyzed and learned it had been contaminated with male fluids. In retaliation, Helen declares her desire to eat such a pizza, and the nurse can only nod in agreement. Satisfied with the meal, Helen reclines, and Robin wishes her good night as she drifts off to sleep. She recalls the time when Michael pressured her to pay him back, stating that he and Karina needed the money. Helen hadn't given it much thought until her best friend informed her that she was pregnant, shocking Helen with the news and fearing losing her friend and the changes it would bring. She lashed out, causing the pregnant woman to leave in tears. With Karina gone, Helen felt lost and contemplated ending her life. This moment brought back memories of her childhood when, on the night before a big dinner, she heard baby Tony crying. Strangely, the turkey in the oven was still breathing, deeply disturbing her. Helen wakes up in the middle of the night and shuffles over to Robin, who's busy recording a song. She reports smelling gas inside her room, prompting the nurse to rush to her aid. However, he smells nothing, and Helen confesses that smelling phantom gas has been a recurring problem for her. But her vulnerability doesn't register with Robin, and he bids her goodnight without much empathy, deeply hurting Helen. The next day, Mr. Memel visits her and gives her a hemorrhoid cushion. As they talk, his daughter brings up his advancing age and jokes about her future inheritance. Suddenly, tears start falling down her face. She thanks her father for the cushion, and Mr. Memel says he has to get back to work. After Mr. Memel leaves, Dr. Knotts enters the room and notices the cushion. He explains it's only for people with untreated hemorrhoids and advises Helen not to use it as it might re-injure her. Dr. Knotts then asks if her wound is bleeding. When Helen says no, he insists it's time for her discharge. When Dr. Knotts sleeps, Helen sits forcefully on the cushion, hoping to reopen her injuries. After cleaning up any evidence, she climbs back into bed. When Robin walks in, Helen mentions that she moved a little strangely. The nurse notices the blood and immediately rushes her out of the room. As they hurry down the hallway, they run into Dr. Knotts, who quickly orders an emergency surgery. While preparing for the operation, Helen urges Robin to call her parents, insisting it's her last chance to reunite them. As the anesthesia takes effect, Helen falls asleep and has a vivid flashback. She remembers the night before a big dinner when she discovered her mother and Tony with their heads inside the oven and gas running. Thankfully, Helen intervened before any serious harm was done. After her successful operation, Tony realizes that his bad dreams were related to the incident. On the day of Helen's discharge, she asks Valerie where Robin is. Valerie feigns ignorance but mentions his recorder and wonders why it only plays static. Helen dashes out into the rain to find Robin. As they meet while he exits the hospital, she tells him he's fortunate they're both heading out, as he can take her home. Helen's long-awaited wish comes true as she witnesses her parents' chance encounter in the parking lot. However, she tells Robin to keep driving, uninterested in what might happen next. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more content like it. Turn on notifications and leave a like to support the channel. Thank you for watching.